Good morning, St. Philip's family. Today we have the privilege of talking about one of the great hymns of the church that was written by perhaps the most unlikely hymn writer in the history of Christianity. This young man was born in 1725 in England, and his father was in the Navy and then had become a captain, and his mother was pious, but unfortunately for this young man, his mother died when he was 6, and his father married another lady shortly thereafter who didn't really like this boy, and so he was sent off to boarding school at the tender age of 8. And while he was there, he distinguished himself from misbehavior, and so finally, on his 11th birthday in 1736, he was sent off to sea on one of his father's ships. And he continued to live at sea on ships and to grow up there until he was 17. And so you can imagine what his character was like at that point. He was a wild young man. And he was very excited to get back to England at the age of 17 to continue his carousing on shore. But unfortunately for him, he was picked up by the press gang of the HMS Harwich and rated as a midshipman and immediately sent back out to sea. Well, he was extremely unhappy about this. So he was rebellious and profane and disagreeable to the extent that he finally was tied onto the mast of the ship and received 96 lashes in front of all of the crew. However, this did not really help improve his disposition. He continued to be a really nasty young man and to be particularly aggressive against the Christian faith, denouncing God, denouncing every type of faith in God as a myth and stupid, and he was cordially disliked by all of his shipmates. And as things went along, they got more and more and more tired of him, so they eventually traded him to another ship, the HMS Pegasus, which was a slave ship. And when he was there at the age of 20, he was so hated by the captain and the entire crew that when they reached Africa, they literally sold him into slavery. He was sold as a slave to Princess P of the Sherbro people, and he served her as a slave for several years before he was finally rescued by a captain sent from England by his father to try to find him. So he was put on another ship, a merchant ship, the Greyhound, to go back to England. But he still was intensely disagreeable, intensely profane, and in fact, the captain of the Greyhound said he was the most profane, obscene, and obnoxious young man that he had ever encountered. And then that fateful time came in March of 1748 when the Greyhound encountered a huge storm off the coast of Ireland, and the ship was foundering. It had holes in its side, and Newton was standing on the deck, lashed to the deck, when his shipmate that was right next to him was swept overboard to his death. And John Newton, this young man, prayed a prayer then saying, "Lord, have mercy." And he is quoted as saying that in that moment, he thought of that time where Jesus went to death for sins not his own and hoped that that might avail for John Newton. And so on that date, March 21st, 1748, came Newton's initial conversion to Christianity. But it was a slow process. He was still involved with the slave trade, but finally by 1754, he had become convicted about that and left the sea and started studying theology, and in 1757 applied for holy orders in the Anglican Church. And he was ultimately ordained and became the rector of a church at Olney in England. And while there, in 1771, his patron, the Thornton family, brought with them to visit their nephew, William Wilberforce, who at that point was an 11-year-old. And Wilberforce's heart went out to Newton, and Newton's went out to Wilberforce, because Wilberforce was growing up in a family that was wealthy but did not know God, and his cousins, the Thorntons, were devoted Christians. And so Newton, remembering his godless youth, began to pray for young Wilberforce and continued to keep in touch with them until they drifted apart in later years. Newton's ministry continued to prosper. His church grew and grew. They had to add on to it, and he began a great career as a hymn writer. And in 1779, inspired by a reading of 1 Chronicles 17 and his own story, he penned the words to the hymn that we now know as Amazing Grace, but which originally had the title Faith's Review and Expectations. And of course, that hymn recounts in vivid detail the wonder of God's grace. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. 'Twas blind, but now I see. Words so very true from Newton's own experience. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed. There was a miraculous event in that storm where the ship's cargo of beeswax and cloth shifted in such a way that it filled in one of the biggest holes in the ship's side and enabled it to drift onto the coast of Ireland. Through many dangers, toils, and snares I have already come. 'Tis grace hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. The Lord has promised good to me. His word my hope secures. He will my shield and portion be as long as life endures. Yes, when this flesh and heart shall fail, and mortal life shall cease, I shall possess within the veil a life of joy and peace. We know these words because we associate them with this great hymn, perhaps the most popular hymn in the Christian faith. But it was not popular at first. It only became popular later on. And so Newton was not particularly known as a hymn writer. He became more known for the amazing work that God did in bringing William Wilberforce back into his life. When Wilberforce came into Newton's life again in 1785 as a young man who had begun to reconvert to Christianity, but he had achieved social and political prominence and didn't know where to turn for advice. He thought of turning to his old mentor, John Newton, that he had not spoken to for years. And so he began to record in his diary that he was praying about going to visit Newton. He actually walked by his house a few times before he finally summoned the courage to send him a note. And they met and they had a joyous reunion where they both felt the presence of the Holy Spirit. And Newton became deeply involved with Wilberforce in the quest to end slavery and the slave trade. William Wilberforce militated about this in Parliament. Newton did in the church, and Newton wrote a very influential pamphlet describing in detail the slave trade, conditions on slave ships, and what it was actually like to be a slave, which he knew from his own experience. And one of the glorious things was that before Newton died in 1807, William Wilberforce, with Newton's help, finally succeeded in passing the bill in Parliament that would outlaw the slave trade. So what of Amazing Grace? Amazing Grace was known in the Olney hymnal, but it was not well known. But when it came to the United States, and it was matched with a tune called New Britain as part of the Second Great Awakening, the hymn took off in popularity, so much so that in Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, the whole hymn is featured along with a new stanza that was added in the revivals in America in the 19th century, when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun. We've no less days to sing God's praise than when we'd first begun. So my friends, Amazing Grace is the story of that no one, no matter how far away they may seem from the grace of God, how profane, how anti-Christian, how obscene and rebellious and indeed evil, no one is beyond the reach of God's grace. So let us be encouraged to share that amazing grace with all those whom God puts in our path, and to sing it out with gusto when that time comes. God bless you, and I look forward to seeing you soon.